Hello, and welcome everyone to the All Creatures Podcast. I'm Angie, and I'm very, very excited for my interview today. It's been almost a year or so that I've been talking about the World Wildlife Fund on this podcast and all the amazing things they do for creatures big and small, scaly and furry. But today, I actually get to talk to an expert from the World Wildlife Fund. I'm so excited today to be hosting Nilanga Jayasinghe. She's a senior program officer that specializes in Asian species, and she's based out of Washington, D.C., here in the United States. I'm really happy to have her here. We're going to focus today mostly on the Asian elephant, which is a species of elephant that's often not as highlighted as the African elephant. And she also specializes in other Asian species such as rhinos, tigers, and snow leopards. And some of her areas of expertise include human-wildlife conflict. So welcome today. I'm so happy to have you. And good afternoon, Nilanga.
Hi, Angie. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. And hi, everybody.
Now, I always like to ask my guests in the beginning just to tell me a little bit about yourself and what is your background that brings you here today at the World Wildlife Fund.
Sure. So as you mentioned before, I focus on Asian species conservation here at WWF based in the U.S. And that means that I work with WWF teams based in more than 15 countries in Asia, working on these flagship species issues on the ground, from everything from Asian elephants to tigers to Asian rhinos, runs a gamut of issues, everything from protected area management to law enforcement, to human wildlife conflict, you name it, we work on it on the ground with the teams there who work to protect these species in the different countries that they're found in.
And how do you go about from maybe just loving animals like myself as either a child or a teenager or even in college to actually the job that you have now where you are and working for such a well-known and well-organized and respected organization like World Wildlife Fund? I mean, you basically have most people that love animals or listen to this podcast dream job. So give us some cliff notes.
Sure. So I think, I've always had a deep love for animals and wildlife. I grew up in Sri Lanka, which is in Asia and is an Asian elephant range country. So as you can imagine, I grew up around elephants, just seeing them growing up since I was a child and remembering being, one of my first memories being sort of intrigued by the notion that an elephant might be, passing by my house. There are captive elephants in the city. They'd be normally transported, walked from one place to another, and they'd wear this bell around their neck. And every time every time they walked down the street, you would hear the bell from a distance. So one of my earliest childhood memories is actually every time I heard that bell, I would run to the window or to the gate at the house and just watch in awe. Every single time. It never got old. As an elephant walked by and, I would watch until it went off way into the distance and just remember being just completely enthralled. It was a magical experience every single time. And to this day, that hasn't gone away. Every time I see an elephant, be it wild or captive, in any situation, it just brings back this wonderful memory and reinvigorates this deep sense of love I have for this animal and all other wildlife. Just being able to experience wildlife either, in the wild somewhere or at a zoo, just being able to see an animal and connect to it is such a wonderful experience.
Well, especially such a large, iconic elephant, an animal as large as an elephant. I mean, it's so amazing that your childhood, you could, like you said, you would look out the window and see that. Growing up for me, I was lucky if I saw some squirrels, maybe a deer here and there, maybe a white-tailed deer here and there. And so just to have that presence, I can imagine how powerful it was, and they're just so majestic. The first time I was able to be close to an elephant, their size blew me out of the water because I work with horses all the time, which are big animals, but they're they're very small compared to an elephant.
Absolutely. And I think and now that I think back on it, I was very fortunate to have had that experience and to have had it influence my life and where I decided to take my career,
Yes.
and it's because of that love for elephants and that deep desire to further not just their conservation, but the conservation of all wildlife, is what eventually helped me decide my career path, and to be able to sort of, you just mentioned it is kind of it may seem like a dream job for many people who want to work in conservation, work with wildlife. It is a dream job for me as well. I, never as a growing up or as even a younger adult could have ever imagined myself doing the kind of work that I do today, being fulfilled every day, doing what I do and knowing that I'm in my own little way, hopefully making a difference for wildlife everywhere.
I think you're most certainly making a difference for wildlife everywhere, and especially Asian elephants. And so, with that being said, how did you get involved with the World Wildlife Fund? Were you a conservation major, or what were the series of different jobs you had earlier in your career that landed you at the World Wildlife Fund?
So my path was not a linear one. It was a long and winding road, which makes it kind of interesting.
It gives me hope. It gives me hope.
Yes. And it is something I always tell folks that there's no one way to do it. There's no one way to get there. And as a, in my educational career background, I was more a humanities person. I was an English major in undergrad, and then a journalism specialist for my graduate degree. And I got my master's in journalism, but I focused on environmental reporting because that's what I was always had a long-standing passion for that, and eventually realized that personally I'd much rather work in conservation than write about it. And then over, long and winding road, going through different positions in different conservation organizations over many years, realizing where I wanted to be, in a programmatic role with a hands-on, role in conservation, working with field teams and doing a little bit of everything. And eventually being able to, come to this position. I think it required a lot of hard work, a lot of new learning. I had to learn a lot of different things along the way through different jobs. And I consider myself to be more on the science side now in my role as somewhat of a biologist in a way, even though that's not my educational background. I am in a way able to combine and use a lot of different skills, I would say, that I've brought from many different fields into this job. And I think that's helped me. That long and winding road and the many experiences, the blood, sweat, and tears, I would say, have helped me to be a better conservationist today.
Awesome. Yeah, I do believe that the multidisciplinary approach of having an understanding of many different fields of study to blend together to just help you have a better, or for me at least, have a better understanding of all the different aspects. For instance, I wish I would have gone to school for learning how to record and talk on interviews. But I'm kind of just self-teaching myself and going from there and learning and reading about it and getting hints along the way. And so, like you said, a lot of it's just looking for that outcome that you want. And I mean, I think you definitely hit the jackpot as a senior program officer, and you're getting to have a hands-on application and programs that are saving these Asian species. And that's where today I'm so excited to talk about the Asian species, the Asian elephant. So for our listeners, could you briefly describe some physiological differences between African elephants that I know a lot of listeners and people are very familiar with, and then Asian elephants?
Yeah, so there are actually a number of differences between African and Asian elephants. If you're looking at African elephants, also there are two species found in Africa. You know, the savanna elephant, of which there are more than 400,000 estimated today, and African forest elephants that are found in the central Congo Basin region of the African continent, of which we believe there to be perhaps around to less than 80,000 or so in the wild. And then on the other hand, Asian elephants found on the Asian continent in 13 countries.
Wow.
There are less than 50,000 we believe there are less than 50,000 individuals in the wild today. So compared to other
Wow.
elephant populations, also they're in a lot more trouble, and dealing with a lot of different threats. And it's really important, I think, that people are aware of the differences and of the fact that there's so much diversity even in the elephant families. And in terms of differences between the species, if you're looking at, savanna elephants, for instance, in Africa, they're much larger than Asian elephants.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yes.
one
Mm-hmm.
obvious difference. In size, they're much larger. They're heavier. They're taller. And another distinct difference is that the shapes and the sizes of their ears are different. African elephants have much larger ears, almost shaped like the continent of Africa, if you look at it. They're large and
Yeah.
in almost a sort of a large triangular shape. And Asian elephants also have a sort of triangular like shape, but they're smaller, much smaller
Mm-hmm.
in proportion if you comparison to the ears of African elephants, for instance. And another key difference is that African elephants, both males and females, grow tusks, which has been a significant issue in terms of the poaching crisis that we're
Right.
seeing today in
Mm-hmm.
Africa, because both
Mm-hmm.
males and females that grow tusks are targeted for the tusks, for the ivory trade. In Asia, only males, and today only a certain percentage of males grow tusks. Females do not. And even with tusked males, we believe, over time, the poaching crisis for ivory originally began in Asia, where a lot of tusked males were poached out. So there's a higher proportion of tuskless males today that were able to propagate, and the numbers are higher today, where there are
Oh,
fewer tusked
interesting.
males.
Mm-hmm.
But also another interesting thing is some tuskless males and some females grow these like teeth called tushes that you might see protruding from the side of their lips. These are not tusks, but they're just larger teeth that they grow. So, but the interesting difference is that African elephants, both males and females, grow tusks, while Asian elephants, only males and only a certain percentage of these males grow tusks. And those are among some of there are many other differences between the two. But if I were to highlight some big ones, those three would be some significant differences that you'll see between the two.
Yes, and we'll put some photos up on our show notes because I think if you look at them side by side too, it becomes very obvious. I think to an untrained eye, if you were just given a test, it might be a little harder.
Yeah.
But side by side, I think you can really see the size difference and the ears, and then overall the height and the weight. So, and Nalanga, do you have a story you want to share about an interaction with an Asian elephant that you've had recently or even in the past besides when you were a little kid and when they would ring the bell? I just love that story because that reminded me of my childhood, but it was usually the ice cream truck,
Oh,
which
right.
seemed cool until you told me the story about it actually being an elephant. That's
Yeah.
way cooler.
I was like that about the ice cream truck too. But, of course, if there was an elephant, that trumped it.
Right, absolutely.
If there was an ice cream truck and an elephant coming down the street at the same time, of course, I'd be drawn more by the elephant.
Right,
But,
right.
ice cream also had a lot of appeal. So I think a really cool story that I can reflect on from a recent experience would be about a year and a half ago. I was in India, in the field, northeast India, in the state of Assam, with the WWF team out in the field. This was monsoon time when the monsoons actually flood many areas. And Kaziranga National Park, which is a famous park and a World Heritage Site, which has significant population of tigers, rhinos, and elephants. About a third of the park gets flooded during the monsoons. And during this time, elephants and other wildlife come out of the park and cross this movement corridor area and go into the adjacent hills to higher ground to get away from the floodwaters. And another key characteristic in this landscape is that these movement corridors are blocked today by a major highway that goes through it, right adjacent to the park. So during monsoon seasons, generally the forest department staff that oversee the park put up barricades on either side of major movement area so that the wildlife can cross safely, so that cars are not speeding through these areas and hitting wildlife as they're crossing, particularly in the night, because that's a really active time for wildlife to cross back and forth. Mm-hmm. So one afternoon we were traveling down this highway, and it was around 4:30 in the afternoon. I wasn't expecting to see anything coming out of these crossing, corridor areas, because normally you'll see it later in the evening. And all of a sudden, as we were approaching one of these barricaded areas, suddenly my colleague shouted out, I was like, look over there. And all of a sudden I look up and this big matriarch elephant steps out onto the road from the park side, looks around, flares her ears at the cars almost as if, telling them to just stay back. We're about to cross the road. And she stepped boldly onto the road and started crossing it. And following her were about 8 or 9 members of her family that just crossed after her. And it was just one of the most magical moments. They just came out, just crossed nonchalantly across the road and went off into the adjacent hills. And I felt lucky because that's not something you see that often, and I was able to capture this image on my phone as well, with the wildlife crossing sign in the background. Oh, cool. And just being able to see these elephants cross at a time when they normally, let's just say, would not be crossing. And what I, in my heart of hearts liked to think was that, they kind of knew that there was an elephant person in the area and they had to come out and say hello. So I like to think that was why, but it was such a magical moment just to see them come out and cross the road and to see these wild elephants, just doing their thing in their natural habitat and doing what they've done for probably generations and generations, crossing back and forth.
Yeah, way before there were roads and
absolutely,
and
way before
crossing.
Roads were there. These are their historic movement corridors that they need to be able to get from one place to another because they're really wide-ranging animals. They're large animals that require a lot of land, an area of land, to make a living in, to find food, to find other resources, and to move about. So it's really important that we are conserving, not just protected areas, because wildlife don't generally tend to adhere to man-made boundaries in protected areas. This is a human
they don't
construct.
Understand the signage. Yeah,
absolutely. So they're going to live as they've always lived. And so I think this is why we also need, when you're looking at conservation approaches, why you need to take a large landscape-based conservation approach to ensure that you're not just protecting protected areas, but everything else that's around these protected areas, because animals are going to travel all over the place, from one place to another, through human-dominated landscapes often. And so you want to ensure that you're working with different stakeholders to be able to conserve the space that wildlife need, in addition to the wildlife themselves.
Yeah, I mean, your story just gives me goosebumps. Picturing that as that would be like a dream come true to see that, and all the elements. But this leads into the next question, though. With the estimated 50,000 or less Asian elephants in the wild, besides obviously major highways, what other pressures are wild Asian elephants facing?
So if you think about the threats that Asian elephants face, poaching, which is a predominant threat for African elephants, for instance, for their the tusks, for the ivory trade, is a threat, but is not the biggest threat for Asian elephants. So in Asia, the area that these animals are found in addition to all the other Asian species that we work on conserving, that area is also home to the world's largest population of humans. It is the most
Right.
populated area of land if you look in comparison to other parts of the world.
Hmm.
In that same circle are also the most number of humans that we find
Right.
today in the world. So you can imagine when you put, all of these, the wildlife and the people all side by side, the biggest threat you can see is habitat loss
Hmm.
because wildlife, different species are constantly losing out on the space that they need to thrive.
Right.
Because there are also human populations competing for that same space, for instance. And so the biggest threat I would say to Asian elephants today is habitat loss and resulting human-elephant conflict. So when they lose, their homes, for instance, and also because elephants are wide-ranging species, as they move about, they're often going to come into contact, and often negative contact, with people that live with them. In
Hmm.
today's world, right? Often you'll find communities and villages and agricultural crops right next to protected areas in many places because, often very poor communities also, these are the only places that they can get to be able to make a living, to be able to grow their crops. And they also have no other option and no other recourse. So it's often a lose-lose battle for both species when they come into this negative contact. When elephants come into these areas, they will often see a crop as a nice meal. And they will come and feed on someone's, rice field. They'll eat their paddy grains, or they'll eat their bananas or their sugar cane,
And you
and
can't really
often
blame
destroy.
them.
Absolutely. And sometimes they have, either don't have enough food resources where they're living, or
Right.
it becomes a learned behavior. They learn that this is an interesting crop source, a food source that is much easier to get than what they would feed on perhaps in the wild. So it is something that draws elephants often. And also this leads to loss of property, loss of life. And in retaliation, people will, turn against these elephants and other wildlife and kill them in retaliation. So this is a
And you
situation
can't
that
really blame those people either. I mean,
absolutely, because most of the folks are extremely poor,
hmm,
often with, elephants necessarily don't even have to eat everything they're, come across. They can even walk across a field and that could be a year's worth of damage for a poor community that's eking out a living in these areas. So if you're
wow,
losing a
yeah.
year's worth of income, that is a big blow.
I never
This is
thought of it
why
that
we have to
way.
work
Yeah.
hand in hand with communities to be able to ensure that we're preventing these things from happening, but also ensuring that both humans and elephants are thriving and coexisting in a way that they're not impacting each other.
Right. And so, can you tell me a little bit about your work at the World Wildlife Fund to help conserve the Asian elephants and its habitat and perhaps reduce some of this human animal
Yeah.
conflict?
Yeah. There are a lot of different activities that WWF teams undertake on the ground across range countries where Asian elephants are found. Since I mentioned that human elephant conflict is a significant issue, it is an issue that all of our teams across all of our range countries are facing and having to deal with and address. So, we work hand in hand, as I mentioned, with communities, with the
Hmm.
governments of these countries, with the forest departments or the wildlife departments that are in charge of managing the wildlife in protected areas, for instance. Also, other partners like other NGOs and other organizations. We work hand in hand to put in measures to both prevent and mitigate the impacts of conflict, but also to address the root causes of the conflict. So
Right.
when the
That's
conflict is
key. Yeah.
happening, you have to help communities to live with the situation or to prevent them by putting in things like fencing. For instance, electric fencing in places that are prone to regular visits from elephants, for instance, that don't block movement corridors, but are in
Right.
a way put in to protect people's crops and their properties, etc. Put in other measures like, deterrents, like training sort of local community member teams to serve as response units. When elephants come in, they're trained on elephant biology and safe ways to drive elephants away from their areas through, use of light and sound and things like that. But also at the same time, we want to ensure that we are addressing the drivers of the conflict, which is at the end of the day is land use, changing land use patterns, habitat loss, etc. So we have to work with government agencies, for instance, to lobby for the protection of certain areas, to keep them protected for elephant use and things like that, but also find ways to replant areas, perhaps historically, that may have been lost to elephants, that was historic elephant habitat, to ensure that they have a place to live in and are not regularly uh, replenishing or reinvigorating, protected areas that may have lost natural fodder, for instance, replanting, native foods or putting in water sources or things like that to enable the elephants to sort of have what they need within where they're living. So
Right.
things like that. There are a multitude of things that are done on the ground, in addition to things like doing research on elephants to understand where they're going, what habitats are useful for them. And that means putting collars on them to track their movements and do sort of radio tracking through collars.
Yeah, like how much land do they need?
Exactly. And what areas are really essential? For instance, if you're protecting a really essential movement corridor or essential areas where they're regularly sort of found in are critical elephant use areas, then you're ensuring that by understanding that, you're ensuring that you're working with governments and land use planners to be able to protect those key areas in order to protect the elephants, but also to reduce issues like human elephant conflict and other threats that they face.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important to understand what you're working with as well. So that research component is critical.
And so, in regards to the Asian elephant conservation, what are some of the goals of the World Wildlife Fund?
I would say where elephant conservation is concerned, the goal of not just the World Wildlife Fund, but also other NGOs and anyone interested in elephants and elephant conservation, I believe it should be to work together to ensure a secure future for elephants, well into years to come, to ensure that they have what they need, that they're protected, and also are thriving in their homes and their habitats, and to ensure that development does not happen in a way that is unplanned or unprecedented, but is carefully thought through, so that we're allowing for not just elephants, but all other wildlife to be able to share the space with us. Because, I personally think it would be such a poor world to live in if we didn't have elephants and other wildlife to share it with. They make us so much richer.
Absolutely.
And just being able to see them and experience, just be in their presence. And it is such a wonderful feeling that I think we would all be so much poorer if this world did not have them in it.
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly. And as you had kind of previously mentioned, I think with them being such a megafauna, such a large animal, putting in these applications to help their conservation helps so many other animal and even plant species down the line as well.
Absolutely.
So it's almost like if you do focus on some of the bigger ones, you're just naturally saving some of the smaller ones as well.
Exactly. Which is the flagship species approach that we speak of. These large charismatic species like elephants, tigers, and rhinos all require large areas of land in which they can thrive. So if you were conserving, these spaces, at a landscape level, with a broader picture in mind, you are also conserving many other species that share that same space with them. So it's a holistic approach to a broad-based approach to conservation, which goes well beyond sort of a piecemeal look at, what we're trying to save.
Right, right. And so I highly doubt there are any, especially after listening to your expertise. But if there was a naysayer out there or someone that didn't agree with money being allocated to save or help conserve Asian elephants or save habitat and land for them, what would you say to help get them excited about Asian elephant conservation, or to quote unquote change their mind, or to get them to pay more attention to Asian elephants?
Elephants in any habitat that they're found in is the largest mega herbivore. Particularly in Asia, they're so critical for a lot of different roles that they play in the ecosystems that they're found in. They can be seen as sort of the gardeners of the ecosystem, because they often, in dense forested habitats that they live in, they will often create pathways by simply their movement alone as they're traveling from one place to another, create pathways for other wildlife to use. Many of the little tracks you find in forests that were not man-made, probably in areas where elephants are found are probably elephant made,
Yeah.
and they enable other species to move about. And also they engineer the system in a way that they serve as seed dispersers, for instance. They eat plants and they eat seeds, and then when they defecate, that seed will take root somewhere else along the way as they're traveling. And those seeds will be able, the trees or the plant species will be able to propagate more broadly as the seeds are being dispersed. And even like, especially some plant species have actually naturally evolved to rely on elephants, for instance, for their seed dispersal. For instance, when elephants eat them, they don't fully digest the seed in their digestive system. So which means that the seed is still active enough to propagate once, it is ejected from the elephant. So this way, it's a really unique and very interesting symbiotic relationship, I would say, that the elephant has with its environment. And also another really interesting thing is when an elephant walks around, it has these big feet, right? This big round feet. And then when they place it on the ground, it makes a significant mark on the ground. It leaves a big footprint. And sometimes in places where, for instance, water will gather in those footprints. And it's like a little well, a mini well, in which other microcosms can evolve. Other species will take root, and tadpoles can thrive in those and become frogs. And so it's really amazing when you think of all of the different roles that they play in an ecosystem. And think about if you take that animal out of that ecosystem, the changes that will be brought upon that area without this mega herbivore making the interesting impacts that it is making where it's living. And also, I would like to add that elephants are very much like us. They are very empathetic. They're emotional animals with significant intelligence. They have a brain size that is very large in comparison to their body size. One of the few animals in the world, and one of the few that can identify their own reflection in a mirror. And they have this amazing sense of empathy. Each individual is an individual like each human is. They have their own different characteristics and their personalities. And just being able to share a world with that kind of animal that has so much to teach us, even from their behaviors and what they do. You may have seen documentaries on how if they find the bones of another elephant somewhere, it may have been an elephant they met along the way in their lives at some point years ago. They'll recognize and they'll stand there mourning that elephant for, a good half an hour or so, or even more. And then, that shows a certain dimension that we can all learn from. And how they work together as a herd, matriarchal herds when there's danger present to protect their babies. That sort of thing is just like there's so much we still do not know about these animals. And if we lose them, again, going back to what I said before, what a poor world this would be.
Yes.
There are so many more arguments I could put forth for why they're important, but I think these are some of the big ones that I think hopefully will resonate with anyone who is a naysayer.
Yeah. And are there any correlations to their economic importance in Asia? Are they bringing any tourist dollars in, or is that helping at all?
Elephants are also very important for the economies of local people because if you're looking at a lot of places where they're found, there's thriving ecotourism opportunities for people who are local people who are able to serve in the tourism industry, either, in hotels or as guides, leading visitors to see elephants, in the wild. Is such a wonderful experience seeing elephants in the wild. Most people when they think of Asian elephants, particularly in the West, think of elephants in captivity and are not aware that there is a significant wild population that, is wonderful to go and see and are also in a lot of trouble that needs our support.
Right.
But also, it's really important to have that understanding that while, you might go and experience the company of a captive elephant by, bathing it or being around it, it's also it's a wonderful thing to actually go and see them in the wild as well. So if you're out there in an Asian elephant range country, please do make an effort to go see some wild elephants, because it just is, it's just a phenomenal experience seeing them do what they do in their natural environment, bathing or playing with each other, or just you name it. It's a fantastic thing to see them doing, engaging in their natural behaviors in, places where they're found. And it's important to forget that. And it's important not to forget the wild elephants that also share that space along with the captive populations that you may see more often when you go to Asia.
Well, and especially too, if you're seeing them in the wild, a lot of your money is usually helping support those local communities, and which is then enhancing the likelihood of more protection and things like that. Because ecotourism,
absolutely,
I think the more that grows with different species, especially with like a mega herbivore like an elephant, it's really going to help the overall cause.
Yeah. And also bringing in these economic opportunities for local communities, to ecotourism can serve as an alternative livelihood opportunity for communities that may be impacted by things like human-elephant conflict. So by providing them with such opportunities, you're also increasing tolerance for living with elephants and having elephants around you.
Yes, definitely.
That shows you that a live elephant is worth much more than a dead one, for instance. You're bringing in tourists, you're bringing in revenue for yourselves, but also you're helping protect elephants and other wildlife. And I think that's a win-win solution for everyone concerned.
Yeah. And so with some of these conservation efforts, and there's definitely some good news stories coming out of 2018 and early 19 with certain species, their population increasing according to IUCN. But a majority of the species are either staying stable or decreasing with population. Mm-hmm. And so for me, sometimes when I'm doing these episodes week after week, it can just seem a little bleak, or I feel like sometimes we're having so many setbacks with conservation. And so since you're in the daily grind and fighting the good fight every day, what helps keep you motivated each day to keep working hard, even if there is a setback?
You're so right in that, in this field, you're often faced with bleak stories and often, see a lot of setbacks, but we're here doing what we do because we have hope. Mm-hmm. We believe in a positive outcome and a positive future for wildlife. And therefore, every day, even if it becomes challenging, becomes difficult, you have to remind yourself that there are good stories out there, good things that have come out of all of the efforts that organizations, not just WWF, but everyone out there that is working towards conservation is, effort that they're putting into reaching or having positive outcomes, that they do make a difference. And there are positive, glimmers of hope now and then, or things that we see that are showing us that our efforts are not in vain. And as long as that's there, and as long as there's hope alive, we can't give up. I won't give up.
I love it.
So that's my sort of mission in that. You got to fight the good fight.
That's right. That's a good mantra.
And hang on till, just keep fighting it until, for me personally, it's like until my last breath. This is a fight that I was meant to fight.
Right.
And I will keep fighting it.
You've always been meant to be the voice for those Asian elephants, for sure. And now, so with that being said, I mean, you're very, obviously you have the dream job for a lot of people, and you're able to interact on the ground and then with other organizations and tons of people that are dedicated just like yourselves. But how can the average person, the average Joe, like myself, what can we do to help conserve the Asian elephant, or for that matter, other endangered Asian species that we've focused on in this podcast before?
I think a big thing that everyone can do, which one of the biggest issues that I mentioned earlier is lack of awareness about Asian elephants. Most people, when you talk about elephants, are mostly aware of, African elephants and their plight and the poaching crisis, etc. But most people are not aware of wild Asian elephant populations that are in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, way more
or
trouble than
how wonderful they
African
are.
elephants. Yeah.
Exactly, and how wonderful they are, and what wonderful role they serve in the places where they're found, and just what incredible animals they are. So the biggest thing that anyone can do is to share the knowledge that they have gained, perhaps through this, podcast or other reading they may have done, and to share it with their friends and family and peers, and to spread that wonderful awareness and the wealth of information with everyone else that support Asian elephant conservation efforts. Make sure you're not buying things like ivory, for instance, when you're traveling out and about. Make sure you're engaging in responsible tourism activities. Go see wild elephants if ever you're in Asia. Please go visit these wonderful national parks and see some elephants and just connect with them. And that in itself will make such a difference and will enrich your life in so many wonderful ways.
Wonderful. And so how can our audience learn more about Asian elephants and also, of course, the incredible efforts being put forth by your team and others at the World Wildlife Fund to help save these Asian elephants?
To learn more about Asian elephants and what we do, you can visit www.worldwildlife.org and explore our pages on Asian elephants, as well as all of the other species that we have listed there, so you can learn about more about what we do.
Awesome. And you guys have a beautiful Facebook page as well.
Absolutely. You can check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter.
Yeah, Instagram is the new
social
new
media platforms. Exactly. So we're on all of them. So if you want to learn more about what we do, please do check them out. And we hope you will visit.
Awesome. And so for any of our listeners out there that are like myself or even younger and wanting to know, how do I get more involved in a career in animal conservation?
Mm-hmm.
What could I do to perhaps someday be sitting in your chair, or out in the field? Do you have any advice for those students or people? Because you're never too old to start, right?
No, you are never too old to start. I mean, I'm a case in point there, I think. And it's really, for me, the key message there is tap into your passion. If that's what you're really passionate about, sometimes, it may take you longer than you thought it would or ever intended it to. But if that is what you really want to do, if you want to work on wildlife conservation, work for animals in some capacity, I would say just don't give up on that passion. Just, there may be a lot of obstacles along the way, trials and tribulations, but as long as you hold on to that vision, that passion, and that serious urge or need to do something and to engage in those issues, it goes a long way. Holding on to that passion and never giving up on, just keeping your eye on the prize. Mm-hmm. And ensuring that you're working towards it by getting the education you need to get the job, getting the skills that you need to work in conservation. And it's not just one thing or the other. Even if you're a wildlife biologist, it's always great to get more experience on other things like public speaking or project management or fundraising
Finances,
or communications. Sure. So it's really important to have well-rounded skills, to be able to make yourself more marketable in this field. And so I would say it's a constant learning experience. It's a learning experience for me every single day. And I continue to learn and grow from everything I'm learning and doing in my job, and everything I'm learning from my wonderful colleagues who are experts in the jobs that they do. And I think it's just a combination of all of that. But at the end of the day, it's really about, if you don't have the drive or the passion, it's going to be a lot harder for you.
Right.
If you do, if you feel that that's really what you want, that's what you want to do, you can achieve it.
Wonderful.
It's possible.
Yeah. And then my last question is, are you guys hiring?
So we occasionally do have, opportunities available listed on our website. So please keep checking.
I will keep checking
our, listing of opportunities. Yes, career opportunities on, our worldwildlife.org website. And who knows, you might see something that you might be a perfect fit for.
Awesome. And I might just invite myself to your next trip to India to see if I can see some wild elephants and support their conservation.
Sure.
Well, great. Well, Nilanga, thank you so much for your time, your passion, your enthusiasm today. I know I've learned a lot about Asian elephants, and I loved them before this podcast, but I love them 10 times more now after hearing all your stories and just putting some great visuals in there and hearing about all the amazing work that your team at World Wildlife Fund is doing to help support Asian elephants in the wild. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Angie. I'm so happy to hear that. And I only hope that, this conversation helps grow the love of elephants among, all your listeners. And thank you so much again for having me. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the loves of my life.
Awesome.
Thank you.
We'll have you back to maybe do some tiger or different species sometime.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you.